Hello, hello. Today we are going to talk about whether or not it is worth getting the Leica Q, the original Q, in 2025, despite it being a 10-year-old camera. I'm also going to be quickly comparing it to the X100vi, which I've had for a little bit. Now, the original Leica Q first came out in 2015, and when it first came out, it had one of the best EVFs and autofocus out there for a point-and-shoot digital camera system. 10 years later, the autofocus isn't as fast as compared to other modern-day cameras or even other iterations of the Q, like the Q2 or the Q3 28 version or the Q3 43. Obviously, the EVF is also not as good, but honestly, it's still not that bad by today's standards. So even though the Q is now 10 years old, it still boasts a 24 megapixel sensor, it's still full frame, and it still has the same 28 Summilux f1.7 that the Q2 and the Q3 have. So we're going to quickly compare the user experience of the Q compared to the Fuji X100vi. I had the Fuji X100vi for a little bit, and while that is a great camera and I used it as a hybrid setup, manual focusing on that camera was a pain. I just didn't manual focus because it's not great. However, with the Q, because of how this lens is built, it's very easy to manual focus and zone focus if you don't want to use the autofocus. Let's quickly talk about the X100vi. It is a newer camera, came out in 2024, so because it's a newer camera, it obviously will have more features and more buttons that you can customize. With the autofocus, you get subject detect, face detect, eye detect. You don't have that on the Q, but if you're shooting it as if you're shooting a film camera, you don't get that on film cameras either. Now we're going to talk about shooting experience, and honestly, they can be quite similar. Both the X100vi and the Leica Q are rangefinder style cameras. They're not true rangefinders, but they're rangefinder style cameras. So if you really wanted to, you could shoot it kind of like a rangefinder. Here's where it's different. The Fuji, like I said earlier, sucks at manual focus. You can do it, but I don't recommend it because it's extremely slow. With the Q, that's not the case. You have a focus tab like you do with many Leica lenses, and so manual focusing on the Q is very easy and streamlined. And so if you're thinking about that, this actually has more of a rangefinder experience than the X100vi does. Now, for full transparency, I had the X100vi. However, I traded it for the Leica Q. Some of you guys might be wondering, why would I trade a camera that came out in 2024 for a 10-year-old camera? I did it for several reasons. One, the Leica is full frame versus the APS-C on the X100vi. And the second reason is because of this lens. This is the 28mm Summilux f1.7. And if you were to buy this lens in their M-mount version, this lens would easily cost you $4,000, $5,000. However, when it comes on the Q, because the Q is such an old camera, this camera can be had now for $2,000 or maybe a little under if it's more used. So essentially, you're getting a Summilux lens with a free camera body. Earlier, I also touched on the fact that the X100vi has more features. It can shoot f-log2, so you can use it as a hybrid camera. The Q has video, but I don't recommend using it because it's trash. But if you treated this camera like an old film camera, the shooting experience is actually quite enjoyable. I actually like that the Q has limitations being an older camera. I think it's more straightforward. I think it's more simple. The lack of being able to customize all these different buttons or use all these different features, I think it's actually an advantage if you're using it as a street photography camera because it's very streamlined and simple. You can simply switch it on and you're good to go. Now, I will say Fuji colors are great. Most people buy Fujis because they like the straight out of camera JPEG looks. But I've never been a JPEG shooter. I've always shot RAW. So for me, having the straight out of camera JPEG looks, I never really used them anyway. When I shot the X100vi, I was still editing all of my photos afterwards. If we're talking about image quality, personally, I think the Q has better image quality than the X100vi because A, it's full frame, and B, you're shooting from a 28mm Summilux lens, which is a legendary lens. And it's the same lens that are still on the Q2 and the Q3. The difference is with the Q2, you have more megapixels, Q3, you have more megapixels, so there's more room to crop, but honestly, 24 megapixels is enough unless you're printing large format prints. So, would I recommend getting the Q in 2025, even though it's a 10-year-old camera? Honestly, I would. Here are my reasons why. More and more people now are actually buying older cameras and older systems because now the price on them have dropped drastically. You still get a lot of camera for the price. And if you're looking to get into the Leica system, let's be honest, Leicas are very, very expensive. But with the Q, now you can get them for around $2,000 or maybe a little bit under, which is still a lot of money. But if you're talking about Leica standards, it's actually quite affordable for a Leica camera. You still get an amazing lens, 28 Summilux. You sacrifice a little bit slower autofocus, but if you're a film shooter, you don't have autofocus anyway. So you can manual focus, you can zone focus. It's very, very quick. The EVF on the Q is fine. It's not as good as the Q2 or the Q3 or modern systems, but it's still perfectly usable even in 2025. So I'm gonna quickly share how I've been shooting the Q to make the shooting experience even more fun for me. I actually switched the LCD off completely when I'm shooting on the streets. So I'm just looking through the viewfinder the whole time and shooting it more so like a film camera. I don't use auto ISO. I set the ISO to a set speed and then I just shoot an aperture priority, but I set the minimum shutter speed to 1/250th of a second so I can freeze everything. I sometimes use the autofocus, but for most of the time I use manual focus and zone focusing because, like I said before, it's very easy on the Q. So because of all this, I do think that even with this 10-year-old camera, the shooting experience is pretty on par with any other Leica camera bodies. Anyway, that is all for today. I just wanted to quickly share why I think the Leica Q is still a worthy option in 2025. See you guys next time. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Bye.